Thank you very much, first of all, for having accepted the invitation for this brief chat. We have KK Phoon, well known. You don't need for me to present you. We are here at the International Symposium on Geotechnical Safety and Risk 2019 in Taipei, and you just delivered a brilliant lecture, a Lacasse Lecture. It was another lecture that you delivered. What did you talk about? Can you tell us something about what it was an interesting and long lecture, but can you tell us something with respect to the theme that I can say it was based on the use of data for geotechnical risk analysis and management?
Well, I think the key theme behind my lecture was data to digitalization. So it's more of exploring the connection between data and decision making. And we've been doing that, of course. That's nothing new. We use data to do calculation, and based on the calculated responses of our systems, we make a decision. And the most common decision that we made will be to decide whether the response of the structure will be safe or not safe. That will be something that we can connect to engineers at a very basic level. My lecture essentially thinks and reflects on whether we can do even more besides this baseline application of data. And therefore, for us to do better than what we're doing now, my hypothesis is that we need to consider more kinds of data rather than the more typical or conventional data that we use, because this data has to be in fairly good condition, fairly good quality. They have to be data that would be meaningful to the physics, because your input parameter essentially feeds into the physical model for you to do a calculation. So an example would be if you're calculating the bearing capacity of a footing, if you're using the classical Terzaghi calculation model, the calculation model requires parameters such as a undrained shear strength, cohesion and friction angle. It doesn't matter. Therefore, you have to somehow either do tests or transform your field test result into an equivalent, a parameter that's suitable for the physical model. So I'm just giving a quick sense about what we're doing.
Well, you were starting by telling us that data have, they fall within a broad range, and we have maybe a few good data in everyday practice, but then we have a lot of what you call ugly data. What's the difference between where is the spectrum of the data that we can use? How do you define it?
There's no strict definition. I'm kind of like pointing out in my lecture some of this extreme condition, so that we could understand we get a more refined understanding of this idea that data can be really good, such as the undrained shear strength information, where you test your materials under controlled laboratory condition, or rather controlled boundary conditions. You get what I call very good quality data, because it fits your physics. And because it's done under a control, the quality of the sample, the quality of the test will be very good. I call that good by my definition. Basically, ugly data will be something that is between good and something that I would call fake. So, in other words, data that are not real. Someone just faked the data. That would be very bad, because that will not give you any information.
Even misleading information, but on average, you can say no information at all, because
that's worse than no information, because I could be doing a test. Say I'm doing an SPT test, but I did not do a SPT test. I did not do I just go to the site and I just fill in the form. I just fill in the form because I know roughly what the number should be. So I just said, okay, this is 10, this is 15, this is 30. I did not do a single test. So I would think those would be defined as fake data. So between what we call data that is not reflective of reality for whatever reason, data that we have been doing which are very high quality, you're actually seeking the data deliberately, maximizing the quality so that you can get high quality input parameters. I call them good. In between, I call them ugly. Say your sampling quality is suspect. Some disturbance. It's not, there's some disturbance effect in your information. So there's one way you can look at ugly data. You can look at data where another form is to look at data where you you get a information based on a few tests, like your SPTN value, but the SPTN value cannot be used for your de Zaghi bearing capacity formula. Therefore, you need to transform your SPTN value to an undrained shear strength, and that incur an uncertainty in making that transformation.
Yeah, of course.
So that to me is ugly, because you didn't get directly what you want.
And then actually you specifically said, the data are the basis for getting to decision making. In between there is a model, either one transformation model or any complex model that we want to use. What's the chain link there, and how would you say that decision making should or must benefit from data? And how is the future, what's your vision of the future for this?
Oh, that's a great question, because actually the whole lecture is to explain that chain, that link between data to decision making. And I can put it in a very simple way, where let's assume that you wanted to use your current a conventional or rather existing practice. You look for very good data, you ignore or you kind of put aside the data that's not so good, and then you make a decision. So there's one possible decision pathway. The one I'm recommending in this case is that why don't we think about how we can use all this ugly data that are not a perfect fit or perfect use to your decision-making process. What I think is and then you think about clever ways of characterizing this data, which will involve uncertainty. That will be a minimum kind of a framework you need to characterize this information. The advantage of doing so is that you can explore very interesting angle in decision making that is not available if you go with the existing approach, where you do a test, you get a number or get several numbers, take an average, you feed the number into your bearing capacity formula, you get a bearing pressure. I'm suggesting the alternate approach, where you use clever algorithms to deal with whatever data that you have. And based on this data, you end up with a decision that can't be perfect, because the data is not perfect. You end up with a set of response or decision that's imprecise. Hence, I showed confidence interval. Now, what is the purpose of making life so complicated? That would be the obvious question. So the key idea here is that if you do that, you can answer a question that cannot be answered currently, which is that, is it worthwhile for me to collect better data?
Absolutely.
There's no way you can answer that question.
It's easy to say, I don't have enough data to do that, full stop.
Yeah.
Whereas you can find clever ways, but
exactly,
probabilistically significant and
exactly,
scientifically sound ways of coping with that. That was the great message that you
exactly. There are two things that you cannot do. I mean, just to follow up your good point. The first thing is that you have no rational way of asking yourself, is it worthwhile investing to collect better data? To me, the only way you can make the argument is that you only pay money to invest in more data if it improves your decision making. So that will be a rational way that I think will be improving our practice. The other angle that's very important is that not all parameters are deserving to be good, because the calculation model is not sensitive to those parameters. To be logical, you should only be improving if you have finite budget, which we do.
Yeah,
well, let's pretend I forgot to mention.
For everything we have finite resources and then budget or time, whatever.
Yeah. So let's ignore the fact that you have a blank check. Someone's going to give you $1 zillion to do what you want. Then forget about our discussion. If your budget is finite, they're going to deploy your budget in a way that maximizes your decision making, which means that you want to deploy on parameters that are very sensitive. You make some imprecision, you end up with a big change in the decision. You can't do that if you don't have a way of dealing with ugly data. Because this idea about precision is part of ugly data. Uncertainty is one of the ideas I shared in the lecture. Of course, the second thing I mentioned is that not every single step in the design process will lead to a decision that's no good. So it's another form of uncertainty, such as you getting a number that's not so precise. You do a transformation of the model, which is also not so precise. The linkages between all these imprecise steps may or may not lead to a proportionate uncertainty in your decision. So there are different parameters that could be sensitive. There could be different steps of the chain of that you make a decision. And not every chain is important, in my opinion. So there's no way you can, in other words, to summarize, there's no way you can detect where is the important part of your data, which part of the data is important, so that you can spend money to refine that particular step. Now that cannot be done in our current approach, which treats every number as deterministic. In fact, in my paper, I posed this question, just very quickly to share with you. And this is a question that all engineers can understand. So the question is very simple. Do you only collect good data? One question. Do you combine good data with not so good data, my ugly data? Second question. Or do you throw away all the bad data or ugly data? Now, these three questions cannot be answered without this particular more sophisticated algorithm. And that simply means that if you don't do it, you're forever only using good data and rejecting a data that you think is not a good fit to the entire decision-making process. So, but this question is commonly used, Mayo. This is a very common set of questions.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yes.
Engineers will ask you, can I combine the information? Because not all data can be combined. Combining doesn't mean you'll be better, Mayo.
No, not necessarily, exactly. But then you need to have a way. You explained it very briefly, but in your papers, you made the references to your papers, and we will read them if we want. The answer is there if you look at those data and you combine them in a certain way. You proposed, like some random variables on the parameters that characterize uncertainty. That's like a very novel idea, but it's
it's just to me. And sorry to interrupt you a little bit.
Absolutely.
The idea here is that we've been doing a lot of this. We've been doing a good job in trying to make decision by following the physics of the problem. To me, that's one dimension. It's a good dimension. We haven't been following the dimension on how you can make decision on data itself. So there's a decision on the physics, which is the bearing capacity. There's a decision on how to collect data and what data to collect. Hence, this question appears all the time.
Yeah, well, especially when you move to complex systems, geotechnical systems, or complex problems that go beyond the normal way of tackling problems.
And I mentioned
and they're coming more and more often in our
exactly.
daily
And
life.
I point out in the lecture that I'm using site investigation data as example in this particular chat we're having. But what about monitoring data? Is that good or bad? Is that good or ugly?
Oh, that's a lot of times it's very ugly, a lot of times. But then it's necessary if you want to track in time whatever you want to track in time, and if you want to use it for performance analysis for the past, or maybe for predictions in the future. I mean, that's
you need it. So it doesn't have a good fit to your physical model. You need to do back calculation, and that is very difficult. But my point is that you already have things like monitoring data that we're doing all the time. We do that for a certain purpose. But we are having a hard time most of the time, in my experience, engineers asking me what data to collect, how much, where.
Sometimes, sorry if I interrupt you, but sometimes maybe the fear of having monitoring data that are conflicting with our models or our ways of thinking let us not look at those data, or even not want those data, because sometimes you say, no, please don't give it to me, because otherwise, you may tell me that something is wrong with what I'm thinking.
No, yeah, that's why people say, and that's just a joke, right? People will say that don't confuse me with data. So I would like to just have a limited number of data that I could understand. If I do produce data that too much data, it's more likely
exactly
that there'll be some data that you can understand. And then you're faced with a dilemma. Data that you can understand, do you want to say that they're erroneous because they don't agree with you? Or data
you were mentioning the chicken and egg metaphor. What is that?
No, I use that. I use that kind of like to give people that very clear conceptualization. And that again, I can put it across, explain to you in a very simple way. That if you were to develop, say, again, let's use a typical example that we're very familiar with. Let's assume that you wanted to calculate the bearing capacity of a footing. You can think about physics, you can think about soil mechanics, you can think about all these failure mechanisms. And then after you have done that conceptualization, you have developed the whole theory and the whole equation, which we have. Very sophisticated stuff all the way to finite element, if not beyond. Then we think about how to go to the field, how to collect data from the field, how we can collect data from a lab. So that chain of argument will be having the chicken. The chicken is the model, the method. The chicken will come before the data. You actually collect data to feed your physical model. So I pose that question, whether we should do it, or rather we should spend a bit of our time, maybe another fraction of the time, on the opposite direction, which has not been, I myself have not thought very clearly, but that will be entirely a different logic and a different philosophy. You have the data, so you start at the egg. I'm not making any demand on the data. So maybe all you're telling me is that I can only give you the response of the nearby building to your structure. Maybe I'm monitoring data. Maybe I have data on past experience, on response of footing when you do load tests. But they're not at your site. They are load test data done somewhere else. I give you a whole bunch of data. You tell me your best assessment, what is the bearing capacity of a footing at this particular site. The question is entirely different. You can throw up your hands and say, I got no answer. But I'm suggesting this egg to chicken, then you think very clever how to create the chicken to make maximum use of whatever information, and I've no constraint on the information it can give me. It can be anything.
Yeah. Well, in the background, we will always have that model that leads us to think a certain way, but it's there in the background, and then you start from what you get from the data and not the other way around, as you said. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean the idea here is that if you think that way, you want to create the discipline, so you want to create a conceptual clarity of this. I use the word rules of the game in my lecture. Rules of the game is very important because it enforces mental discipline. The rules of the game in the chicken and egg dilemma is that you start with data. You don't go around telling the engineers do more tests, use this equipment to gather more information. So that's the rule of the game. You tell me what you have. I'm not going to make any judgment. I have the data on my table. I start thinking a clever way how to use that data now. So this mental clarity is, I think, is rather important. I agree that all of us think chicken and egg both ways.
Yes, but also I should say it depends on what you're tackling. So like when something is well established and your mental model is really adequate for what you're tackling,
that's true.
I would say that's okay. But then when you're tackling problems that require data analysis, like everything should require data analysis, but that are requiring thinking that is not straightforward, then your approach is
your point can be summarized in something that I wrote in the paper, which is that if you approach the problem based on the chicken to the egg, you create the chicken and then you ask for the data to analyze your physical model. That direction of argument can never improve the model.
Yeah, as you said, the tradition is there, and another way of saying it, you said it in the lecture.
Yeah.
Tradition takes is not
No.
is tradition is tradition. It's
Exactly.
It doesn't change. Or
No.
it requires a lot of time.
No. So if you think that in the future if we think that that's a good thing to have, where we have an algorithm that's constantly updating based on data. So I keep feeding data to you, and this is not a science fictional kind of a fantasy, because nowadays there's all this discussion in the newspaper of 5G, Internet of Things. The world that we are thinking about now gathering data has nothing to do with geotechnical engineering. It's just that all this new hardware development and telecommunication development, internet development will swarm us with data. This has nothing to do with us.
But that leads us to another topic altogether, and it's a topic that will be discussed actually even in a short workshop tomorrow, like the machine learning and
the dialogue,
artificial intelligence topic. But in your lecture, you briefly mentioned, you went into that by saying, humans are always there and must be there necessarily, even if artificial intelligence is able to, down smart the most clever chess player or like a Go player in the world. Is that I did understand correctly?
Yes, you understood correctly, although I actually left that as an open question. So when I did my presentation, I was, at least that's my current kind of like thinking. It may not be right, but the idea now is just to think about what are the clever ways you can use with data alone, with no human. And then after that, you think about what is the gap. Despite your best attempt, you came up with this decision recommended to be done. Then we ask ourselves, what is the gap? The gap should be representing something that the human should fulfill. That's my thinking. The reason why I think along this rather simplistic direction is that I'm making the claim that no human beings can deal with massive amount of data. We are not.
Yeah. Our brain is not.
No.
Engineered for that.
No, we are not engineered to deal with zillions of data points, multivariate, deeply correlated. So I think I'm making a reasonable assumption that what those algorithms are doing in machine learning, they are doing things that the human has no role in, because there's no way you can make sense of it through you can hardly play a human role. So I'm just making the thinking that since the human cannot do it and the machine learning or whatever data-driven method could do it, why don't we explore what they can do and what's the outcome of the exploration? So they may make a recommendation on the decision. And then we have to think about maybe that decision is not perfect. It's not likely to be perfect because of uncertainty. The data is ugly. Then I think we can ask ourselves, what is the more meaningful role that the human could come in? Maybe the human could come in and they could bring in their understanding of geology. Remember, I did not talk about physics, I did not talk about judgment, I did not talk about ethics. I think this will give us greater clarity what is exactly the role of the human engineer. So that is my strategy now. You think about what the data, what the methods could do, algorithm, you get an answer. Then you start asking yourself, can the answer be directly used? It's not likely that it's possible. But by doing that, at least you know what the answer would be. Is it good? Is it poor? Is it like totally hopeless? I was mentioning to you over tea that in my current line of research, I'm not assuming that I'm not making any judgment that my result will be good.
No,
I'm just saying how far can we develop it so it may be excellent. It's unknown now. It may be totally nonsense. I don't think we should make a judgment before we try. We are having that chat. I don't think anybody knows. Some people will say that it is nonsense, but you haven't done anything. Some people may claim that it's the best.
Yeah, both claims are extreme.
Extremes.
Because we're always somewhere in the middle. Somehow.
Exactly.
I can guess that we are somewhere in the middle.
It's likely that we're in the middle, and you can't claim that because you have no demonstration that it's the best, and you have no demonstration that it's nonsense. And yeah, I agree with you fully that my guess, except since we are like academics, we try to be precise. I did not do the work, that's why I said I'm just guessing. Our guess is that it's in the middle.
And there may be a probability distribution there.
We do not know. And then there will likely be a meaningful role for the human engineer. But I think if I use my kind of strategy, I can clarify in more detail what is this role of the human engineer. Because when I do that, my research will generate results, and the results are testable, like what I demonstrated in my presentation. You can actually test the outcome. In one of my PPT, I showed that this is the 95% confidence interval predicted by the algorithm. And you can check whether the measured undrained shear strength falls within. So they are testable. They are not like untestable. And therefore, we will know based on this evidence how good these methods are. And that will be the first step. And then after that, you'll be able to have a greater idea where would the human engineer come in a way to fill in the gap. Because we agree there will be a gap. These algorithms cannot be perfect.
That's that brings me to maybe a final conclusion of this chat. The role of the geotechnical engineers, because we are geotechnical engineers, but in general engineer, will change in the future, most likely. We're saying it. Things are changing fast, so that it will change. But in changing it, there will always be, most likely there will be a role that is different from what we are used to think of now. So your framework somehow clarifies that that's the case.
No, absolutely. I agree that again, it's not reasonable to think that whenever technology changes, because technology interacts with the human.
Yeah, we are there.
We are interacting. We are not independent.
Until we are there, we're there. Until we are here, we are here.
Yeah. So I think it's not reasonable for us to say that the changes in technology. Let's assume that you have this mechanization due to the past industrial revolution, and having mechanical machines doesn't change the role of the human engineer. I mean, you go back to history where there's no machines, then engineer plays a one role, and then now you have computing power, you have mechanization, that changes. Everybody is predicting that the next stage of evolution is this evolution of information and data, and I think it's logical just by extrapolation that again our role will change in some unknown way at this point in time.
In some unknown way, yes.
But, but I think
if you are aware of that, that's
of course. But
we will be better off.
It'll be better off. I think so. People are struggling with that now, and I actually thought that collectively, which I think you would agree that I think the first thing we got to accept is that you will change. This change to me is almost inevitable. I don't know change where,
exactly.
But I'm betting against the fact that it cannot be the same. I think that is kind of reasonable. So I think we need to work together with the industry, even with the governments, and we need to study, because we are researchers, we need to study how this change will take place and where it will take place. I thought that would be a more reasonable role for us to play. And that will also help us to educate the next generation of engineers, because they'll be the ones subjected to the most change.
Absolutely. We are also educators because we are working in the universities, so like it's also our role to tell the young people.
I hope you don't mind that.
The most relevant things.
Yes. So we talk about research for most part of this chat, but I wanted to quickly bring in that actually we have a big role in education, and if both of us are thinking that change will happen, then I think that there would be a very important responsibility for the professors like us to prepare our students for this change. And you cannot prepare them for this change if we ourselves do not have a rough idea how the change will take place. So there's another part of it that we are discussing at my university now. So education itself is now coupled to this question.
Yeah, it gets in because
it gets in. Yeah. So this is to me a very interesting point in time for us to be involved in this research. And I was telling, I mentioned in my lecture that actually the community for this particular conference, which are people working on data, because statistics is data.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a very sub-community of the general geotechnical engineering community. But if you are in this community, you're aware of the.
You are, because we're at the forefront of this change. Because we are the one who is most familiar with data. When you do statistical analysis, you're doing data. So I made that clear in my lecture. But I think our community has a responsibility to work on this, because we are the most familiar with data. I think we need to struggle with these questions that we're having this chat with. We are the most well equipped, although we may not be well equipped. But we should be leading. We should be leading. Thank you for the word. I think we should not be waiting for things to happen. Because I'm not sure whether you agree, if you look at all the sub-disciplines in geotechnical engineering, there's only one community that is using data as their core of these are the people doing probabilistic work, statistical work, because that is about data, right? And if we think that the changes are going to come about due to this data, which is what everybody is predicting, then our community has to be a leader. We may be a reluctant leader, but we have to be a leader. And I've been, and of course I'm saying that because my personal vision is that there should be one motivating factor for us to want to lead, because then we can make our students more well prepared. It's back to the education. My biggest fear is for us not to change. We continue teaching our students based on what we've done in the past, which is absolutely working well, but for how long we do not know. And the career lifespan of our student is not 10 years. If you assume that our students in the universities now are in their 20s, I think they are.
Yeah.
And assuming that the retirement is 65, it will be longer, I think.
And assuming that their path will not be linear for most of them, because that's
so you're
reasonable
talking,
assumption.
Is all these are reasonable? You're thinking about preparing your student for the next 40 years. So I think you'll be really strange, although it can happen because we are probabilistic people. It's possible that 40 years later, the situation in the world is the same as today. It's one scenario. Low probability.
Very low probability.
The higher probability is that 40 years from now, the world will be completely different. I think that's where the bets are taken now. So, therefore, I hope you don't mind that I shared this reason why our community needs to take the lead.
Absolutely, actually.
And then the students are actually affected.
By being also in another subset of the community that is engineering education, because I'm active also in that community.
Okay. Then
you
are the precise person.
It strikes.
Thank you. I didn't know that you are. Yes. So I keep telling people this is not just simply about research, because it's about preparing students for the future. And the only way you can say that you do not want to do that is that you have already made an assumption that the future will be the same as the past. I don't agree, but there is a probability the future is the same as the past. But I would rather take a more, I think I'll take a more higher probability assumption that the future will be very different, and we need to start thinking. So my lecture fundamentally was more of like hoping to get more of us to think rather than me having. That was when I started my lecture.
No, exactly. That's why
I
said at the beginning it was very inspiring, because it was framed in a way that is really, forces us to think about that, what you said, and the future, and like how to move forward as well, not only how to look at what we have.
No, and my entire speculation could be wrong, but if I do manage to get some of our colleagues to think, I think that will be really meaningful to me, and because by not thinking, then we are subscribing to that low probability event that the future is the same as the past. We drop into that assumption, even if you're not conscious about it. But if you think, then you will already subscribe to the fact that the future will not be the same as the past. So my lecture fundamentally was to see whether I can ask colleagues to start questioning. They could even question my assumptions, but by questioning, and we're having our dialogue tomorrow on machine learning. So that dialogue, the purpose is to get more people to question and to try, and then maybe to demonstrate is really useful, is somewhat useful.
Is there a potential or not? And if there is, then you just keep working on it.
Exactly. Or the potential is zero. Exactly. But that's useful to us too. Someone coming up to demonstrate that we have there's some exceptional feature in geotechnical engineering where we're not going to be part of industry 4.0. We can write a paper on that too.
I don't know.
It's low probability.
That opens another topic altogether. What's geotechnical engineering, the art of engineering?
Exactly. So that will also refine our thinking about our role, even just thinking about all these questions that I posed in the lecture. So I'm really glad to hear that that the lecture creates something.
It resonates with someone for sure.
Thank you so much.
For sure, with me. But I think with many of the people that listen to you today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this chat.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much.
Bye.